Hello. This is Lisa with Unexplained Arkansas, the podcast, and this is episode 80. This is the crash landing of American Airlines Flight 1420, and this is part 2. So if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, stop, go back, and start part 1 up. So I do have a little pod business. So we do have another new Patreon member. Thank you so much for joining us. It is Kim M, and so we just had a Kim H. So this is Kim M, and we're really appreciative to all our Patreon. So our Patreons do receive online shout outs. They get kind of first information on stuff, and they also get bonus content episodes. Once a month, they're going to get a new episode, and there are currently several episodes out. If you join the Patreon, you can go back and listen. In March for the Patreon, I'm going to cover the Zodiac Killer. So just FYI, if you want to get all that extra content, just go and join our Patreon, and there will be links in our show notes for that. But definitely check us out on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. We're on all the platforms. We'll have links to all of my contact information on those platforms. So feel free to connect with me. And if you have any questions or content ideas or just anything you want to visit about, feel free to comment here on the episode, or you can email me at unexplainedarkansas@gmail.com. So would love to hear from you guys. And I do have our merchandise on sale on the website. So just FYI, if you want a deal on some Unexplained Arkansas merchandise, go check that out. So where we left off is the plane crash, crash landed at the Little Rock Airport. And this is, like I said, flight 1420. It finally came to a rest horrifically 880 feet beyond the runway there in Little Rock. And of course, they landed in a storm. They ended up crashing 50 feet from the Arkansas River. So where we're at right now, it is right at midnight. It is dark. It is raining, and people, are scared. They're injured. So we're going to kind of take off from this time frame. So just think, there was a survivor, Mark Schmidt, and he would comment how all of the passengers on the plane were thrown around the plane in the crash, and he ended up actually with broken ribs and other broken bones. But when, the plane came to a stop, he was in shock. He didn't even know he had these broken bones. He was just in shock from the whole ordeal, and he had no clue how badly he was hurt. All he knew was that he had to get away from the plane. Because again, we talked about this in part 1, the plane is on fire. So Renee Salmon, another survivor, recalls there was just a deadly silence of it all. Once the plane came to a stop, it was just silence. And she just knew she was dead. Like, she believed she was dead. She didn't realize she wasn't dead until she heard her daughter screaming. Her daughter would be burned, and they would end up, she would end up with her daughter being taken to the hospital. And as Sharon Engelman, she would later write, she has a blog and whatnot, and I will attach all my references. But she wrote, people laid on the wet ground with broken, protruding bones. People laid bloody heads in the laps of others. People hunched and cowered to the ground. There were voices moaned and wept. A woman started screaming and flailing her arms when she realized her travel partner was missing. Though we never really said it, we all thought we were the only survivors, only 15 to 20 of us. So this is what she had written in her blog. And prayerfully, of course, we do know there were more survivors. But at this point, they don't know what's going on. They know that they've suffered this ordeal that's, life-changing, and that's all they knew. And as we discussed before, it did take the fire and rescue 18 minutes or so to get to the crash site. 18 minutes. And once they did show up on the scene, the fire, and rescue, they did help get people out of the plane that were trapped. So, because Michael Origel, co-pilot, he was the co-pilot of, the plane that night. He was the non-flying pilot. So he immediately calls American Airlines dispatch right after the plane went down. So American Airlines, this is not normal, but because he did call them, they knew right away what happened. And they would immediately get on their phones with their corporate spokesperson and kind of get really everything moving, as quickly as possible. I'm sure it was a "are you kidding" type of moment, it was awful. So the spokesperson at the time, his name is Chris, and he immediately moved into action. And again, he is the spokesperson for the airlines. And, nothing against the airlines, but, they're going to want to, of course, take care of the passengers, but they're also wanting to take care of their, shareholders. So this is kind of like a double whammy. All these, these passengers have been in a crash, and you're the airlines. And so you can imagine what all is going on in that. So the Little Rock American Airlines general manager, his name was Craig Klein, and he had actually gone home for the day. Again, this is midnight. A gate attendant and 4 other workers were scheduled to help Flight 1420 on its arrival. But because the plane was 2 hours behind, 2 more people were asked to stay that worked for the airlines to help get the bags off the plane as quickly as possible because it was just it'd be so late, everything was delayed. A few of the workers were on the actual concrete at gate 5 at 11:50 p.m. So they were watching, for the plane, and they watched the plane touch down and they watched the plane roll down the runway, and it was rainy. They could not see beyond that. Like, they had no clue that the plane never, came to a stop and ended up crashing. They had no clue of that. They were all they knew is they were waiting for the plane to taxi to the gate so that they could get, all the baggage, off the plane. So at 11:55 or so, American Airlines phoned, Greg Klein at home, telling him the terrible news about what happened. So he rushes to the airport from his home. It looks like he did not live in Little Rock. It took him about 45 minutes. And in that time, he did call about 17 of the 52 people that worked for the airlines at that time in Little Rock. And he told them to set up a makeshift command center in his office. And he assigned someone to answer the phones, and he dispatched workers to go to they called it the IMAX Theater, and we'll get into this, but that was the building on the airport at the time that was supposed to be like a kind of like a designated crash site kind of hub. So he did tell people to get over there. He also sent 3 workers to the fire station at the airport, where survivors would also go. And then he sent 8 workers to the actual crash site itself to try to help passengers and survivors as much as possible. And they did get help from two workers from Southwest Airlines and then another from Continental Airlines. And it just hit me. I don't even know if Continental's still in business. I don't know. I'll have to look that up. So they all joined in the rescue at the crash site. And again, all that they know, this is right before midnight, all that anyone knows is that the plane has crashed. So they don't know anything more than that at this time. So of course there are family, there are friends that were there waiting at the gate on this plane. They were waiting for their loved ones to arrive. And the workers cannot tell them anything. Like the workers, and really the workers don't even know anything that are working the gate, but they really can't even if they did know something, they can't relay what they know. And of course, they don't want to cause panic. So additionally, the Little Rock airport then and even now is not a 24-hour airport. They do shut down the gates, so people kind of have to meet in the main lobby, or, if you've ever been to Little Rock Airport, like you walk in and it's like a big lobby, and then you've got the place where the baggage, whatever the baggage claim area is. So this is before 9/11. So if you're listening to this and you're so young that you've never experienced actually getting to go and wait on people at a gate, I kind of experienced a lot of flying before 9/11. And you could go up to the gate. Anyone could walk up to the gate. The airport was open. And of course, now it's really not. So it's kind of different then. But back then, these friends and family were at the gate. But yeah, they were, basically they were told, okay, the airport is closing. So then they usher the friends and family. And all they've told the friends and family at this point is there's been some sort of landing issue. That's all that they know. But they do tell the families to go to the lobby of the IMAX theater. And basically that's the Aerospace Education Center, which was near the terminal building. I've never been to that. I don't know if it still exists or whatever, but that's what it was at the time. So unknowing to them, this was the place designated for any plane crashes at the airport for people to go. And they don't know that. They just know some sort of landing issue. So at this same time, so obviously a lot is going on in these moments. But at the same time, the Little Rock Police Department, they had been notified. And so they notified the Pulaski County coroner, whom at the time was Dr. Mark Malcolm. So all he was told is that the plane crashed. So he has like a small staff of just 2 investigators, and he loads his coroner's van up with gloves and tags and everything that he needs. And he brings along 200 body bags because he's not been told anything. He just hears the word plane crash, and I guess like anyone else, you just go to the worst case possible. Obviously, he's got to be prepared for whatever, but he has no clue what he's going to find at the crash site. He does arrive at the site at 1 a.m. and he does see all the ambulances are there, so they are loading up all the injured people that they can. So at this point, it's still dark. It is dark. It is, it's just very chaotic, I'm sure. So he just jumps in and helps with the people that need help, the people that are living that need help. So likewise, right at this time, the time of the crash, American Airlines, they have a duty, it is their responsibility when one of their plane crashes, that they're supposed to call the National Transportation Safety Board. And this is an agency, it's an independent federal agency. It kind of is put in place by Congress. So it's kind of Congress, managed. And it is to investigate all crashes in aviation. So right away, this is done. They get a team right in action as well. So everybody's just, this is a plane crash is a big to-do. Obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about the DC flight that went down, recently. But yeah, it's a huge deal. It doesn't happen that often. It is a rare deal, which is good. But, when it does happen, it is a shocking, horrific, horrible ordeal. And everybody is just, we got to fix this and we got to help. So they call in the National, Transportation Safety Board. They call in their lead investigator at the time, and his name is Greg Feith. I think I'm saying that right. So he is based in Florida. So he is in Florida, and he is world renowned. If you've ever watched any type of Mayday or air disaster show or documentary about an air crash, he more than likely was the investigator that they're interviewing. And I believe he has retired now, but I think he still does consulting work. But he is on all the shows, and he is very knowledgeable. So they call him in, and he arrives in Little Rock by around 4 a.m. or so. Meanwhile, this is obviously an utter nightmare for American Airlines. This is not, something that they ever want to see happen, of course, for humanity's sake and then their bottom line sake. But in Fort Worth, they change their automated message about Flight 1420, because normally I guess people would call in and they just have a prompt, and instead they put all calls related to 1420 through to a live operator. So American Airlines, they get a minimum of 250 workers in to start what they call the Customer Assistance Relief Effort Team, which is CARE team. And half of these people would be sent to Little Rock. They just say, pack a bag, you're going to Little Rock. The rest of these people, so about 125 people, are working the phone. By 1:30 a.m., they had 13,000 calls about this flight. Kind of the kicker is, American Airlines has 20,000 flight attendants and pilots in their company, and all of these people's families are phoning in because they don't have a clue where their family member is flight-wise. They don't know, so they are obviously distressed. They hear, the word is already out about a plane crash, an American Airlines plane crash. So again, by 1:30, American Airlines have had 13,000 calls. By 2:30, the CARE team at American Airlines, they had enough information to at least confirm a name that was on the flight, and then to whoever was calling in, and then to be able to let them know which hospital the person was transferred to. If they were transferred to a hospital, they would not be able to state any type of status on the person at all. Even if they did actually know if the person was alive or not, they couldn't do that. By law, it is the coroner's responsibility to relay information about if someone has passed or not. And at this point, the coroner doesn't know. He's out at the, site, and it's still dark. So the coroner, there's just that's going to take some time. So American Airlines is not supposed to give, the public any type of pertinent information. The responsibility on that falls to the NTSB, I'll call them the safety board, to tell the public about deaths, survivors, and such. So the safety board is supposed to be the contact as far as discussing what's going on. The airlines is not. The airlines is supposed to keep their mouth shut. The last major crash before this accident was a TWA flight in 1996. And so there were a lot of new regulations that came out from that situation because evidently TWA spokespeople had given out a lot of information. And so they were told not to. So now it's between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. American Airlines does get a bus. So they get a bus that was going to pick up the passengers, the survivors that weren't, so severely hurt as to be in the ambulances. And then they were taking these passengers, either to the fire. Some of them went to the fire department on the airport, and before they went to the IMAX theater. Some of them were just, if they were non-injured persons, they were going straight to the IMAX theater. So this was happening. They were trying to get them out of the crash site. And again, these people, they're covered in mud. They're covered in jet fuel. They're covered in blood. They have nothing. They don't have baggage or anything. And, of course they're, even if they're from Little Rock, like if the people, and because most of the people were flying home, quote unquote, but not everybody lived in Little Rock. So these survivors were right away being put up in the Holiday Inn right there that's by the airport. So they were trying to get them, I guess is helped out as much as possible. But again, these people, I can't even imagine it's just hard to wrap your head around this trauma. But this was kind of the thing. They were busing them away from the crash site, getting them to the hub, the IMAX, theater, and then getting them into a hotel or just getting them wherever they needed to be. So that was kind of what was going on at this point. By 3 a.m., the coroner's team, they're still there at the site. They do start to search for bodies, and they're having to use flashlights. And so they decide to just start at the front of the plane, and they basically are assigning numbers to the victims. So because they can't assume anything, all of these people are going to have to be, identified and such, but they're just assigning numbers. So the very first victim number 1 is Captain Rick Buschmann. So he is labeled as number 1. Dr. Malcolm did the best he could at that point. He was trying to take photographs. It's still dark. He was trying to take photographs and making notes, and basically he was just trying to wait for daylight. And at the same time, we know that the safety board had sent Greg Feith. There's 2 Gregs. There's the American Airlines Greg, but this Greg Feith, let's say, he is there on site by 4:30, and he tells Dr. Malcolm, do not move the victims yet. Like, you can take your pictures, take your notes, label, but do not move the victims. Because part of everything's under investigation right away. The part of the investigation is to take measurements and such of everything, of the bodies, where things, just kind of landed, I guess. So by 5:57 a.m., Dr. Malcolm now finally has some daylight, and the rain has moved out. The rain has moved into Tennessee, it said. He does get policemen and firemen together, and he tells everyone to link arms, and he has about 100 workers, and they make a grid. They have to make a grid. They're trying not to miss anything, anybody. So one step at a time, they are gridding out the whole crash site all the way to the river. They have to cover the whole site to ensure, no one is missed. So they're gridding this out. That's a hard image, That's just a sad deal for sure. So the safety board, by 8:30, they hold their first briefing with the media, and they kept it very short. They didn't say a lot. There was very limited information for them to legally get out. Basically, there's been a crash. They're gonna say the minimum. So, at that time, the safety board was set up in a small conference area in the airport. So that's kind of where they were. By this time, the temperature is rising at the crash site, and Dr. Malcolm is given clearance to begin moving bodies out because, as you can imagine, it's Arkansas, it's June, it's humid. Yeah, it's not great for bodies to be out in that. So they are getting the bodies moved. At 8:45 a.m., James Harrison's body is removed from the rear of the plane. He was literally steps from the exit, and he was only 21. He was the 21-year-old, and he was the student and part of the choral group with Ouachita Baptist University. I'll call that OBU, but he was with that group from OBU, and he died right near the flight data recorder where it's mounted, it said. And of course, the safety board did retrieve this immediately. Obviously, the data recorder is a huge piece of their investigation. It does say, and there's kind of some different things. I believe it's Sue Gray. Some cases called her Sarah, but at 8:51, I'll say Sue Gray is removed. She is 88 years old and a retired school teacher from Russellville. And there were several, from Russellville, and we'll talk about that. Right after Sue, there was Gordon McLaren. He is a 64-year-old retired chemist from Russellville. He is removed. At the same time as all this is going on, American Airlines, they decide to hold a news conference in Fort Worth. And even though they're not supposed to give out details, they did let the public know the pilot was dead. They stated that. And the safety board evidently was furious, and there would be lots of exchange of not nice words and letters on letterheads going back and forth between the safety board and American Airlines. But all American Airlines had to say on that was just they don't, they have a public, and they weren't going to let people wonder, they were going to tell people. And I'm sure that, to me, it puts them in a very hard place to say nothing. But obviously you can't say a lot. This was 9 o'clock in the morning. There was just still a whole lot going on, and what can you say? So it's kind of like, I'm sure it stunk. The media is wanting answers. People are wanting answers. So it's a hard place to be in. I can only imagine. Right after they find Gordon, they do find Judy Thacker's body. So they remove her. She was actually in the grass along the right side of the burned fuselage. She was right ahead of the wing. She had been carried that far by her injured husband. So he had gotten her that far, but then she passed. And Judy was just she was just 53 years old, and she was vice president at Russellville's River Valley Bank. Now, at 9:40, Dr. Malcolm freed the bodies of Gordon's wife, Joyce. She's a 65-year-old, and also a woman named Mary Couch and Betty Ingram. Now, Mary was a 68-year-old retired school teacher, and Betty was 69 years old and retired secretary from Russellville. Again, all these people had been sitting in a relatively close location, and I talked about this in part 1. They were right at the spot where the plane separated. And so some of these people were ejected. Some of them, were ejected into the fire. Like the fire came up because of the friction caused by the crash. So when the plane separated, they just fell right into the fire. Or some of them were actually killed by just the smoke inhalation. So those two things. But we're talking 6 people. They were on this group trip to Europe, and they were all from Russellville. So it's just terrible. Rick Buschmann, his body was cut from the wrecked cockpit. He's the pilot. He was cut away at 10:59, and then the last victim was removed at 11:25, and that was Deborah Satari, and she was only 38. She was from California, and she was sitting in first class, so she was up front kind of with the pilot area. So the police do escort the 9 bodies to the medical examiner's office in West Little Rock, and this is right before noon. So right before noon, they think they at least have all the bodies out. Now, after this, Dr. Malcolm, he heads to the safety board's command center at the Riverfront Hilton, and they have set up there by noon. And so he has to, provide 100% identification. So he has to meet with the families, and he's asking the families for photographs. He's asking them for jewelry they wore, scars they had, broken bones that they would have had prior to the crash. Like, he's looking for anything, any type of help in the identification process, because these people are, some of these people, and we'll talk about it, how they identify, but he has to be able to identify. So Deborah and Judy would actually be identified using photos, but, and again, you had 9 people actually dead at the crash. You have 2 more in the hospital that will pass away at a later time. But, those 2, Deborah and Judy, were the only 2 out of the 9 that could be identified using photos. The rest of the passengers, that passed, they would have to be identified through dental records. And that just, I don't know, there's something horrific about that. Just the fact that they were that unrecognizable is just, that one hurts. That one hurts me. It's just not fun to think about. So obviously when this crash happened, we just talked about it, there's a horrendous amount of pressure on all parts. And evidently, at least at this time, the Japanese decide to get involved. So evidently, and I thought this was a little interesting tidbit, but anytime there was a plane crash at all in America, the Japanese embassy, they were first to call in because they wanted a list right away to ensure there weren't any Japanese nationals on the flight. They wanted answers immediately. Obviously, they couldn't get in. I mean, it's hard to get all this information to them, so it took a little bit, but they would give them at least a verbal confirmation early on that there were 0, Japanese nationals on this flight. Now, the actual list wouldn't be even out available until 3:30 that day. So, of course, the crash happened on the 1st. It's now June 2nd, and it would take, it's going to take a little bit. So the list of people on the flight wasn't ready until 3:30. So within hours, the safety board, of course, they immediately start on their investigation. They had to do on site. So the transportation board, of course, they're looking at all kinds of things at the site. They had to take pictures. They had to do measurements. They're looking at the crash site. They're looking at the runway. And they would see from the runway that the plane, there's skid marks from the tires on the runway. They could see that. And then, of course, they could see where the plane went. But they could clearly see the plane swerved all over the place. They can see that. But they're taking pictures. They're taking measurements. They're seeing the swerving. They're investigating it all. And as all parties kind of continue to work at the crash site, there was concern that perhaps the body was missing because at the crash site, there was an extremely foul odor by June 3rd. So evidently, American Airlines checked, and everybody was looking, at the manifest, and they're triple checking the passengers, the passenger list. And they're like, no one is missing, but yet there's this smell of decay. So they look again at the items on board the plane, like cargo items, and evidently there was 100 pounds of elk meat in the plane's crushed cargo space. Ugh. Can you imagine? And of course they were relieved to know it's just the elk meat because, this is a crash scene and you're smelling something horrendous anyway. So luckily it was the elk meat. In the meantime, having taken notes from a crash that had happened at JFK a year before, American Airlines went ahead and doled out $25,000 to all the families that lost a loved one and the survivors. So right away, they cut checks for $25,000. Right away. I mean, they knew. They knew that, I don't think that this was I'm buying. I don't think they had any malintent with this money, but they knew that these families would, especially the one, obviously everyone involved in the plane crash would need money for different various things, whether they were injured, I mean, whatever, but they just knew that money would be a huge factor, and there would be litigation. There would be lots of litigation around this whole thing, and we'll get into that. But they, just note, they do cut checks of $25,000 to every single passenger right away. Also, while the crash is being investigated, Jeffrey Stewart, he was 33 years old, so he was an Air Force engine mechanic from Oklahoma, and he had lived through the crash, but he had suffered like enormous head injuries in the crash, and he did pass away on June 10th. And then likewise on June 16th, Rachel Fuller, she was with the group from Arkadelphia. She is the youngest victim of the plane crash, and she was only 14. She had, again, been traveling with her family, her dad, who was like the choir director with OBU, Ouachita Baptist. So horribly tragic, can't even, 14 years old and just, on a flight. But she had multiple injuries. She had broken bones, and they had to amputate her and leg, I believe, and then she had been burned severely. So she just could not, her injuries were just so severe. And as you can imagine, in this enormously tragic situation, there's a large amount of responsibility, and it's a horribly devastating issue for the families, and everyone is going to play not everyone, but most of the people involved are going to play the blame game. And really, there's a responsibility there. And American Airlines, they first want to point the finger directly at the Little Rock National Airport. Now, the safety board, of course, this is early, and the safety board's investigating. They do not agree with this, and they don't cite in their not to say that the airport, we'll get into all of this, but very beginning, American Airlines is pointing the finger at the airport, and very beginning, the safety board is like, no. So just note that, and we'll get into all of this. But the safety board would interview, in their investigations, they interviewed 50 to 60 survivors. They would look over, obviously, every single thing. You've got the black box, you've got the onboard flight recorder, you have the cockpit, all of that chatter, everything's being recorded. They were looking at the weather, so they did have meteorologists looking at the weather. They knew the weather was a huge factor, and that was very clear from the go. And then also what was clear just from the cockpit chatter was that the pilots were stressed and that they were tired, and they were missing obvious alerts, related to the wind and the visibility. They were missing things. The safety board's biggest question kind of immediately was, why did the pilots attempt to land in the violent storm at all? Like, why did that happen? That was their first big question. And what they discovered in their investigation was that pilots, did tend to land in storms quite often. It wasn't rare, unfortunately. Even though pilots are trained to not fly into a storm, there was a study by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or what we call MIT. The study was in 1999, and it found that when encountering a storm that was rated very strong or intense, while more than, like when the pilots are more than 15 miles from their destination, about 26% of the pilots would go straight through the storm. They would go straight through the storm. Now, this is when they were 15 miles out. Now, when, that number, that 26% went up to 90%, when the pilots encountered a storm and they were less than 15 miles to the airport. So basically it was kind of like weird. I guess the mentality was they're this close, they're going to get there. And especially when the pilot knew another plane had gone through the storm already, or unfortunately, the flight was running late. Like if the flight was running late, they just kind of threw caution to the wind, and 90% of the pilots chose to fly through the storm. So, that's a problem. They found the pilots would risk safety just to keep a flight on time. So, it was an industry problem across the board. The problem in the industry literally was given a name. And it is like, I'm going to quotation marks this, but get there-itis. Like it's literally a thing. It's a condition that basically sets the crew's mindset to just get there. And I think we had talked about this in part 1. Pilots are very task-oriented. You give them, a goal and they're going to, I have to fly this plane and I have to land it. Like they are very task-oriented. They do not want to divert. And we know from part 1 that, even before they started the flight, they knew about the storm. They felt like they could get ahead of the storm. But they, and they talked about, okay, well, what happens if we don't? Well, we're supposed to fly back to Dallas or we're supposed to divert to Nashville. But once they were in the air, once they were actually flying and actually encountering the storm, the pilots didn't mention that. They didn't mention a diversion. So this get there-itis is definitely a problem. And just, mistakes get made. So just like with Flight 1420, the safety board felt due to the fatigue that the pilots had as well. They missed call-outs. They didn't finish their checklist. They misheard the weather reports. It just wasn't phasing them at all. They were getting these reports and it was just like, okay. Because of all this, they opted for non-standard terminology. So they were, just completely abandoning what was their normal protocol. And this caused issues in understanding this big picture of, hey, we shouldn't be flying into this fierce storm. And they just missed it. And so a huge factor the safety board also looked at, huge factor, was what was called the automated spoilers. So the automated spoiler is a panel on the wing that rotates down and it reduces lift and creates a huge drag. And this drag slows the airplane down. And it also, of course, it's reducing the lift, so it kind of pulls the plane more to the ground in a more efficient way, and thus the plane can more efficiently stop. So it was described like when you're riding in a car and you stick your arm out of the window, like you can feel the drag. You can feel your arm. So this is kind of what the spoilers do. And they were obviously like a super important portion of the landing checklist. And the safety board, they listened. Of course, they're listening to this cockpit recording, and there was never a mention that was audible about the spoiler system being deployed. Like they'd never heard it. They also interviewed passengers, survivors on the plane, and they specifically asked the ones that were, seated to where they could possibly see the spoilers, and they asked them, like, did you see these spoilers? Did you notice? They were trying to get an idea of what happened with these spoilers. So none of the passengers either noticed or saw the spoiler flaps engaged. And I will post pictures of kind of everything that I'm talking about, just so you can kind of get a visual on that. But the safety board also conducted 2 test flights that made it obvious that when the spoiler system is put in place in the cockpit, there is like a clicking. there's a clicking sound when they engage that spoiler system. And this was they never heard that clicking on the cockpit recorder. So they were very, that clearly, with all of this information and what happened, they could clearly see that the spoilers, that they were not engaged. They were not deployed for this. So the safety board, it takes typically 12 to 24 months for them to investigate a crash. And sometimes it does take longer, but the average time is 12 to 24 months. And this time, the safety board, they're looking at every single component. Like we talked about, they're talking to survivors. They're also, they took not just survivors, but they spoke to witnesses. They're interviewing people that witnessed the plane crashing as well. So they did find a witness there at the airport, just to discuss, like people discussing, okay, what was the weather like at the time? And a man waiting on his wife, like he was in the airport waiting on his wife to land, and he noted that the storm at that exact time, like he described it, is very intense. It was so intense that there was hail, like there was even hail going on. Another witness, I think he was like an over-the-road truck driver, like he would also recall the rain at that time, at that moment, like storm, like it was torrential rain. So that was something, they're not just interviewing survivors, they're interviewing, I'm sure they interviewed everybody at the airport, everybody that they could find that was around at that time. So during the investigation, the safety board does conduct hearings, and survivors can go, and they do, like at the hearings, they're interviewing people, and they do interview the co-pilot, Mike Origel. So he was questioned, and he stated that he called for the spoilers to be armed while doing the landing checklist. So this is what Mike Origel states. And that Captain Buschmann, and then he goes on to state that Captain Buschmann must not have armed the lever. So he's under oath, I guess. I think they swear people in that he did call for, the spoilers to be armed. So the safety board doesn't believe him. They've listened, they've heard, they do not believe that. And the cockpit voice recording proved that this never happened. And neither pilot ever mentioned the spoilers. Furthermore, in the hearings, Mike stated in one of the moments, I don't know if he's lawyered up or whatever, or if American Airlines, has instructed him, but he states in one of the moments, there were a few moments in the cockpit recording that are just inaudible, meaning, it was so slight, a conversation, or just, it couldn't be picked up. So he says conveniently, in those few and far between moments, that he had told, Pilot Rick to do a fly around. He states that he told him not to land in the storm. And quite honestly, the safety board did not believe him. So he came off as not being believed by the safety board. They felt he was just covering his tracks and feeling extreme guilt over the situation. However, I guess he didn't feel bad enough to throw the captain under the bus on the spoiler issue, but another issue. But anyway, so he came off looking this way. So we mentioned survivor Renee Salzman before. So she actually went to the hearings conducted by the safety board, and she wasn't too pleased. She felt like the questioning of the co-pilot just wasn't as, she wanted answers. she wanted the truth, and she wanted answers, and she was, she conveys later on that she just felt like he was not telling the truth, and this infuriated her, and really she was angry that the safety board wasn't, I guess just the way that they were questioning was too nice in her opinion. So she wanted him to be grilled, and and she tried to go to the hearings every single day that she could. So after many, many, months, this was over a little over 2 years. I mean, this is a big, huge investigation by the safety board. Of course, they look at so much, but they do release a 230-page report. I can't say I've read the whole thing, but I've looked over the whole thing. They released this on October 23rd of 2001, so right over 2 years. They would ultimately find the probable cause of the crash was the flight crew's failure to discontinue the approach when severe thunderstorms and their associated hazards to flight operations, had moved into the airport area, and the crew's failure to ensure that the spoilers had extended after touchdown. So the flight crew's impaired performance, they stated, was resulted from fatigue and the situational stress associated with the intent to land the plane in the circumstances of the storm. So their continuation to approach landing when American Air and really ongoing on this was, they continue to approach, the landing when American Airlines maximum crosswind component was exceeded. And they also stated the use of the reverse thrust was greater than, I guess, the engine pressure ratio. So that was a problem, but really the spoilers not being engaged was the biggest problem as far as trying to land. So the safety board, due to their findings, made several recommendations to prevent such an accident again. So the safety board, they're there to investigate. They're there to do their findings, and then they give recommendations. Now, the recommendations are not put in place unless the FAA puts them in place. So we'll kind of talk about this. So the first thing they said that both pilots, like the recommendation now, is that both pilots verbally confirm the spoilers being armed, and that the pilots verbally confirm whether the spoilers have in fact been deployed after touchdown, and that MD-80 series pilots be instructed to use a lower reverse thrust power setting so as to not have the same issue with the skidding on the runway. And then the air traffic controllers need to upgrade their weather radar. So that was a factor. And that the controllers also need to give firefighters all known information about location of the crash. And of course, this is in response to the horrific tragicness of, the rescue crews. They didn't know where the crash happened, like what part of the runway. They just knew it was on the runway. And so it took 18 minutes for them to get to the crash site. So that was definitely, something to fix. That a review be undertaken to find more structures near the runway that could be frangible. And again, we talked about this. So in part one, the crash was obviously a problem because, when the plane went off the runway, it hit the lighting system, which normally all equipment like this is supposed to be frangible. It means it goes away, like it can easily be pushed over, basically. So because of the proximity to the river, these items were anchored. They were steel. And so these steel structures being so close to the runway caused the plane in the crash to be basically divided into three, spots and kill the people at these, crash points. So that's a factor. They wanted that, fixed. Lastly, the safety board, they had already actually made this recommendation already, but the FAA hadn't put this item into place. But they had already said there should be flight time limits on, the time that the pilot can fly, because they reiterated that, this crash happened because of pilot fatigue. So that was a problem. So these findings of the safety board, at least for the passengers, I mean, obviously made sense. Like everything made sense to him. But there's still a whole lot of anger. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of, I mean, we're human and we want someone to blame. And this was horrendous. And there was a lot of people angry. They were angry at, Rick the pilot. They were angry at American Airlines. And then some were angry at Little Rock, the airport itself. So within 6 months of the flight, there were multiple lawsuits. We're talking by December of 1999, the judicial panel for on the multi-district litigation consolidated the various federal lawsuits and coordinated pretrial proceedings because there were so many, there's so many passengers and there's so many lawsuits, so they're trying to organize these, and they do assign the cases to United States court senior judge Wood, and he is in the eastern, I would imagine was in the Eastern District of Arkansas. In the lawsuits, the passengers sought compensatory and punitive damages from American Airlines. American Airlines, in these proceedings, they admit liability for the crash, and in individual trials, they were scheduled to assess the proper compensatory damages. American Airlines does reach a settlement agreement with most, and it does say the majority of the passengers. So a majority of the passengers do settle their claims with American Airlines. And it does state that the settlements, basically, if they're settling, the passengers couldn't go after punitive damages. I mean, if they're settling, they cannot do that. But there were 3 passengers that tried to do so. So basically, they didn't want to settle. Now, they did end up, most of the passengers, in these lawsuits, their award in the lawsuits were between $3 to $5 million. Now, the people that there were 3 passengers that tried to go after, more, and they were denied that. Now, I did read there was one lawsuit. It was Manus versus American Airlines, and it is stated to be the largest compensation to a passenger that didn't die in the crash. So evidently Manus was a mother with 2 small children on board, and they do survive this crash, but they filed a lawsuit because of the, PTSD that they received from the crash. And I can only imagine all of the post-traumatic stress from all of the passengers that survived this. So yeah, just can't even imagine. But that suit is actually evidently like a big to-do suit because it was a very large compensation for actually PTSD. So a final lawsuit was filed by Rick Buschmann's family, his widow and his estate. So they filed a wrongful death suit against the Little Rock National Airport. So they alleged if the approach light supports were frangible, meaning, could be easily pushed over and, weren't steel based and anchored like they were, that Rick would not have died in the crash. And they were, the judge agreed with them. So the airport was found to have failed to comply with airport safety standards. And Rick's estate also alleged that the spoiler system was deployed, but it malfunctioned. So they alleged that the spoilers were. Now, the jury, they did agree with them, I'm sure, primarily on the basis of the light supports. Now, I guess in the Buschmann's mind, they were happy with this. The verdict would seem to absolve Rick, of fault. However, the safety board did not change their ruling, and they would not change their ruling. The reward to Buschmann's estate was $2 million. That's what they were seeking. And about 10 years after this happened, so probably around 2014 or so, an attorney named David Rappaport, he was a member of the court-appointed plaintiffs steering committee regarding, all these lawsuits. So he commented on, the passengers were rewarded, an extreme amount of damages from American Airlines, who stated they were responsible because the pilots were responsible, thus American Airlines. So he surmised Buschmann might be absolved in this particular lawsuit, but he stated all the quote unquote reasonable people who were fully informed, obviously disagree with that, absolution. And so, he would go on to state that he totally agreed about the non-frangible objects, how that they shouldn't have been in place, there. But it's still, basically people still very much believed that the pilots were at fault for not engaging the spoiler system on the plane. In all of those lawsuits, all of the money rewarded to the passengers was, in those findings was pilot error, So today, obviously, so that's all the, the lawsuit troubles, and we'll kind of get into that because I found some more information. But, today the Little Rock Airport, has made a lot of safety changes since 1999. The runway for 4R now is much longer. I believe that they extended several of the runways. They also installed engineered material arrestor systems, which is basically like an advanced installation that acts like a runway truck ramp, but for planes. So basically that's what they have installed. And they have definitely removed any non-frangible items. Immediately after the crash, the survivors would get together, but there would be memorials put in place for the passengers that died that day, and in remembrance of all those passengers that didn't make it. So there's 10 passengers. In 2004, they did put in place the memorial, a memorial ceremony with the memorial that is in Little Rock. So it's kind of a little bit I think it's on Roosevelt Road there in Little Rock, but there is a memorial in Little Rock. And some of the survivors were angry because Rick Buschmann was recognized in the memorial. So there was a lot of back and forth about that. Rachel Fuller, the 14-year-old that passed, like even her father, he stated that, he definitely felt, he was an advocate. I wouldn't say he was in charge, but he was very involved in the memorial itself. Like he raised half the funds himself. I believe it was like $30,000 for the memorial, which about half of it came from the state of Arkansas, and then the other half came from his, and other people's fundraising for it. And, he said that, he understood the feelings of some of the survivors, but passed away, and his family, it would not be fair to his family if he wasn't involved in the memorial. They did evidently not place him in the memorial as a pilot. There were a lot of people not happy about it. There's just a lot of disagreements on that. A woman named, her name is Gina, and she was interviewed. Her and her husband were evidently, on the plane. They were survivors, and they were just angry. I don't know if I pray they're not angry to this day. This article was written in 2004, but they refused to go to the memorial because they were still angry, with the pilot, and I don't know if they were angry with American Airlines or whatnot, but they were very angry. It caused a lot of, problems in their life, and I do understand that. So there was a lot of anger there. Other survivors, we've already talked about Renee Salzman and Mark Schmidt. So they do, Renee mentioned that she did blame Rick for the incident, that he was responsible in her eyes, but she did not hate anyone. She did not hate him for it. She did not hold any, hatred in her heart about it. And then Mark Schmidt stated, he actually, I guess, compassionate for Rick, and just mentioned that Rick was caught up in a very bad situation. And he had actually visited Rick's grave, which is like in Colorado, I believe. So he didn't have any malice at all. So there's a really big divide in the survivors about how they feel. I mean, no, I don't want to degrade anyone, but Rachel Fuller's father he lost his 14-year-old in this plane crash. So, it's just very telling that he was very, I don't know, his heart was full of forgiveness, or, at least acknowledging, people, it's a huge mistake, but people are human. So I think that that's very, I don't know, touching. In Russellville, there is a memorial set up for the 6 residents that they lost, that day. Mary, Sue, Betty, Gordon, Joyce, and Judy. So they have a memorial. It cost around $40,000, and evidently American Airlines did pay for that memorial. So I believe in the Little Rock Memorial, they did not want the funds to come from American Airlines. But in this case, in the Russellville Memorial, they did pay for it. In Arkadelphia, there is a memorial for Rachel Fuller, and I do believe that they have set up like a scholarship foundation for her in her name. And then there's a memorial for the Washita Singers. Rachel was from Arkadelphia, and then James Harrison was part of the Singers. Every year between 2022, I don't know if he still does it, but the father of crash victim Deborah Satari, so he would elaborately decorate the exterior of his home in Vallejo, California, because she was, from California, and he would decorate it with Christmas lights and decorations in her honor. She really loved Christmas, and it gained a lot of national and local attention, but that was his, memorial, at least there in, California. She is, of course, in the memorial in Little Rock. Yeah, so you have the memorials, you have the lawsuits, it's a horrific thing, of course. Obviously, the plane crashing, a lot was learned. There haven't necessarily been those same mistakes made. And of course, a lot of good and safety measures came from this crash. Unfortunately, crashes still happen. So just like, this year. So we did, you guys are aware of the crash. It happened recently in DC. That happened this year. So the Black Hawk situation, and it killed everyone on board, and it was just devastating. And worst of all, it's like on, people have videos of it. It's just horrific. And we may not know any answers, for a couple years. And I just pray we get the answers for all those poor families and friends, and just that more helpful things come out of this horrific day. Now, typically, when a flight goes down, and this was something, I wondered in my head, did they retire the number? So American Airlines did discontinue the use of flight number 1420. So that flight path was reassigned as 646. So they did retire the number. I think I'll cover this in the future, but there is a haunted Eastern Airline flight 401. And for a while, they actually, after that crash happened, and this happened, I believe in the 70s, and I'll get into that, but they didn't retire it at first, and then I think eventually they did, and obviously there's no longer Eastern Airlines anymore, but it was fascinating to me that they did retire Flight 1420. I did read that the co-pilot, Mike, he did continue to fly. He flew for American Airlines, and then I believe he owns his own company now, and he has he continued in aviation. But from what I understood, the 4 flight attendants did not. They never flew again, from what I understood and what I could find. One of the flight attendants did state in an interview that she wasn't worried about the plane itself. She was worried about who was flying it. So, and I will say, and I told this in the beginning, I watch a lot of these air disaster shows. I've probably watched 30 to 40 of them. They're fascinating. And I will say, like, almost every single one of those was pilot error. I mean, it was not the plane. The planes are made to fly. I mean, not to say that there's stuff that can't happen mechanically, they're made to fly. So a lot of it is pilot error. So it's just very fascinating. And it's, of course, it's terrible. So I love you guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I say enjoyed, like, found it informational maybe. But I am going to be working on lots more content coming your way. And of course, I'm working on Unexplained America coming your way. Love you guys. Bye.